Baltimore, past, present, and future. And the key word, of course, is importance. The port has been a terrific part of the past in Baltimore as well as the present. It's going to be important to the future. It's the area of the state's economy which perhaps more than anything else is involved in international affairs. And certainly some of the great issues of the day, such as security, involve the port. So if one's going to address this particular topic, there is absolutely no one more appropriate to address it than Helen Delich Bentley. And if you've gotten the most recent description of the port's activity, of course, it's the Helen Delich Bentley Port of Baltimore. Helen has been with us for a long time. Helen was asking you all to respond to that. Oh, no, Helen really meant get on with it, Frank. So that's all right. All right, I will. I'll make this as short as possible. Helen is not a shrinking violet, if you didn't know that. But everybody knows Helen Bentley, and they know her reputation for energy and commitment and success in all that she does. I was reflecting on the fact that I've been in Baltimore for 4 decades, and Helen, more than 2 decades before that, was already reporting for the Baltimore Sun on the maritime industry. She was a maritime reporter and editor, starting in 1945 and lasting until 1969. Her television show, The Port That Built a City, later and State, was popular. Helen did all the writing, directing, and presenting of that. She knows the port, and she knows the workers, she knows the commerce, she knows management, has been hugely successful in dealing with all aspects of the port. In 1969, she was made chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, a federal position, of course. Was there until 1975. She holds the distinction of being the 4th most senior woman to hold a position in the federal government. Later, as you all know, for 5 terms, she was congressman representing the 2nd Congressional District, spearheaded a lot of things, including the 50-foot dredging of the channel here, a major accomplishment. And now, of course, she heads up the Helen Bentley and Associates consulting firm. Her honors are innumerable. Her awards are clear. She's one that caught my attention. Among the many launching, she's christened 16 American flag vessels. She holds 10 doctorates, including those from Maryland and the University of Baltimore, but also her home state, the University of Missouri, and distinguished institutions such as the University of Michigan. Everyone recognizes, the success of Helen and her qualities, and secondly, her just absolutely rugged determination in everything she does. Helen is truly a legend. We're absolutely delighted to have her with us, the Honorable Helen Delich Bentley.
You know, Frank, I could have had you go on, but you got a fact wrong. And I had to get up to correct it. My native state is Nevada. Now, the University of Missouri did honor me because that's where I graduated from where I graduated. But Nevada, 8,000 feet above sea level is where I grew up. And I haven't forgotten it. And as a matter of fact, I was looking at some old pictures the other day of the old town. It was a small copper mining town. And my nephew sent me these photographs, and there was the school, the elementary school, that we walked to in 6 feet of snow all the time. And we didn't have snow days then. But anyhow, it's a lot of fun, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. And I can say this. that one of the great blessings of my very long association, I've lived here much longer than I've lived in Nevada, so I can say that, my association with the great Port of Baltimore, and it is the great Port of Baltimore, which is celebrating its 300th birthday this year. And is that it puts me on common ground. That's kind of funny. Pretty good, Keith. With any person or any organization in Maryland. It doesn't matter where in Maryland. Last week it was in Bethesda, where I addressed a gathering of representatives from foreign embassies in Washington about the port's role in setting such a high standard of living in the Baltimore-Washington corridor. And I could take that same message, whether it's to Bowie or to Berlin in Worcester County or to the Eastern Shore or Beaver Creek in Washington County, way out west. Not my west, not my original west, but the western part of Maryland. So all you have to do is kind of change the name, put a different title on it, and plug in the names of companies or industries or whatever else that's an offshoot of the port which is near and dear to them, so they can relate, because it does involve everybody. And you know what else? Almost every time, both myself and many in the audience come away amazed. They come away amazed. I am about what little knowledge people have about the Port of Baltimore. And the Port of Baltimore's very rich history in Maryland's development, in Maryland's economic development, in Maryland's history. So capitalize that word statewide, because it's a key concept. And then there are always people in the audience who walk away amazed that they could be so unaware of the breadth and the depth of the port's endowment and the primary role it plays in each person's everyday life. Just as it did in the lives of all of our ancestors, going back many generations. And you know, even though, as I said, I grew up in Nevada, the port played a role in my ancestry because both my mother and father immigrated through here 101 years ago, when the North German Lloyd Line brought so many immigrants from Europe to the United States down at Locust Point, North Locust Point, and that's where they came in. And I kind of say that's why I've always loved the Port of Baltimore. Now, the people who are not aware of Baltimore, I'm not angry at them or anything, but we accept the fact, those of us who've been in the industry so long, we accept the fact that they don't know about it. You want to know how long I've been hanging around the port, the waterfront? I'm not going to tell you. Some of the people like David Thomas back there says that I was a chief mate on Captain John Smith's rowboat. He lies, of course. But when you live to my old ripe age, they start giving you awards just for showing up, and that's what the governor did recently when he named this the Helen, Delich, Bentley Great Port of Baltimore. He said she showed up. Got to do it. And he made that announcement during our gala, the celebration of the 300th anniversary, which was held on June 1st down at the new cruise terminal. And that was quite a night. It was a night that was completely sold out. It was a night that we had to turn people away. And wasn't that exciting for an event for the port, that we had to turn people away? We had 1,200 there. And everybody, both business people and the workers, they wanted to say to the port, thank you for playing such an important part. This is our payback time to you. So it was their payback time because for 300 years, think of it, the port has soldiered on as an engine for statewide economic development, building the business climate year in and year out. And when we're talking about economic development, no one has ever done it better, nor as long as the great Port of Baltimore. The port was open for business nearly 70 years before America became a nation. Think of that. And was the breath of life for a very wobbly Baltimore town when it came to life in 1730, where the marshlands then emptied into the Patapsco, and they amalgamated 5 of the ports of entry. The first port of entry was Whetstone Point, which is now where Locust Point is. And the other one was Humphreys Creek down at Sparrows Point. And then we had Jonestown and a couple of others. But let's talk about the people who have joined us in celebrating. And the gala wasn't the only celebration or event we've had this year. We've had schools, we've been at different kinds of ethnic festivals. We're going to be at the Fells Point Festival this weekend. Again, all pointing to the importance of the port. And the people who are joining us are not just the executives, but they're the workers. They're the workers from the banking and financial services and insurance companies and the industrial transportation, from information technology, you know that great word IT these days, retail and wholesale warehousing, cars and off-road vehicles, forest products and building and construction, major bulk commodities, and all manner of consumer goods like textiles and food and drink, you name it. The port plays a role in all of it. In short, the people who have been saluting the port with us in this 300th year have said, we're dealing in whatever Americans want or need, and it comes through our port. So it's kind of satisfying to me that these people at least know where their paycheck emanates, where it begins, and that the port's going to play a role in their next paycheck. They all know that their business would be shut down in a Maryland minute without deep water ports like Baltimore. Remember what happened when the West Coast was shut down 3 or 4 years ago? Los Angeles, San Diego, San Pedro. And the country almost went bonkers because car manufacturing plants were closed, et cetera, because the material that was coming in by ship was dead. Nothing was coming in. So you and I can say, because we live here, that the Baltimore-Washington corridor is truly one of the nation's garden spots. This is why we enjoy a high standard of living. And in this era of globalization and in a single world economy, the laws of supply and demand, which govern our everyday standard of living, are increasingly at the end of the maritime chain. And if you don't believe me, as I said, watch what will happen if we have another disruption at a port. We've got some pretty good workers in the Port of Baltimore, and we've been very lucky. We haven't had any real interruptions here for a number of years, but I can remember back in the early 50s when there were strikes, and I can remember when New York was almost always on strike, and the cargo was diverted here. And I can remember telling fibs about the fact that some of those New York mafia types were going to come down here and raise trouble in the Port of Baltimore so we could get everybody revved up. That was 50 years ago. I don't have to account for that now. So then you ask, well, if a port's so important, and all of this is so important in the maritime chain, why don't we think higher of the ports, all of the ports' welfare on the national agenda? Dr. Byrd mentioned port security. Well, let's talk about port security. The airports have received over $15 billion for their security. The ports have yet to achieve $1 billion altogether. And we have 351 registered ports in the United States. So you can see how you stretch that money out. I know that our port would like to have another 14 million real fast so we could give it all of the security that we think is necessary. But when you're waiting on that federal budget, and they do have some problems over there in Washington, because us good guys aren't there anymore. We just have to take our turn. And but one of the reasons that they get away with is the fact that the ports operate out of the public eye. You know what they say, out of sight, out of mind. The Port of Baltimore is a vast operation, and would you believe it? There are 45 miles of waterfront in our port. But like the ship in the night, the port slips right past most Marylanders. We're all too familiar. I mean, we see the airplanes, and we see the trucks, and we see the railroads take the train up to New York or to Washington. But the shipping remains shrouded in mystery. And yet, the ships are the real workhorses of the transportation chain, transporting cargoes from all corners of the world to and from. I bet there isn't a single pair of shoes in this room, on your feet, of course, that didn't come in from a foreign manufacturer. Came in by ship. You talk about clothes, you talk about coffee, you talk about sugar, you talk about tea, and you go on. And the port plays a role. The imports wind their way into our lives. The raw materials that come in to our gypsum, to our wallboard plants, U.S. Gypsum and National Gypsum, which employ about 600 people in this area. The steel mill, which still brings in chrome ore, iron ore, and a few other delicate ores. They employ about 2,500 people, and so the chain goes on and on. And our ships even move exports, but on a much lesser scale than the imports. But just remember, all of this goes on in a port 24/7, 365. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And Baltimore is multiplying that by 300. Think of it. That's a lot of putting out. Earlier I said how lucky we are living in this dynamic region anchored by Baltimore and Washington, two first-class cities. But without the Port of Baltimore, this corridor would not be such a land of plenty. It would be something lesser and smaller. And I have even said that without the port, Baltimore would more likely resemble Crisfield, Maryland. The Port of Baltimore first opened for business, as I noted earlier, in 1706. And right from the get-go, it became obvious to area merchants that they could best generate return on investment by hitching their wagons to the port. And as I've noted, I don't care what cargo you're hauling, whether it was, and tobacco was our first export, tobacco. That's where Rolling Road out in Catonsville got its name. They rolled the tobacco rolls down the street coming to the port. Flour was another major export, which began by Dr. John Stevenson in 1752. And then today, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we are bringing in automobiles and forest products, which dominate Baltimore's waterfront. The formula still holds. So you have to say that to build a city and a state with the right mix of blue and white collar jobs, with cultural and ethnic diversity and gusto, and opportunity for all. Nothing gets it done like deep water ports, like our deep water port of Baltimore. There is simply no substitute for ready access to world markets and raw materials. And with globalization, the advantages enjoyed by the region served by the port will become even more pronounced. As winners and losers emerge in the new global economy, we believe that Baltimore is going to make out better than most. The impact of maritime commerce on this city and state is so vast that it defies easy comprehension. The influence of the port extends way beyond old ships and old salts and other waterfront fixtures. Let's take the B&O Railroad. Conceived here in 1827. And why? It was conceived because the merchants here in town, the merchants were worried that the Erie Canal being built to connect the Port of New York to the Great Lakes was going to result in a lot of business being lost to this area. And so they put their monies down and their brains down, and they said, we got to have another form of transportation. We have to have a land form of transportation to the Great Lakes. And that's how the B&O Railroad was born. And there was one man who was determined more than any of the others. They were all working together, but one man was so determined to leverage the Port of Baltimore's inputs and outputs, imports and exports. And his name was John Work Garrett. And Mr. Garrett is the gentleman who built the palatial evergreen house, still standing out on North Charles Street. That was his way of saying, thank you, Maryland, thank you, Baltimore. But when you consider that they built the railroad, what goes into a railroad? There were a lot of other economic byproducts. There were things like locomotives and cars and tracks and bridges, which meant the construction of shops and offices for operation, which meant street improvements and new housing, creating demand for brick and iron, engineers and architects, and general labor. You know, the one thing that they didn't think of at that time was that at some point we're going to need a deeper Howard Street tunnel. And they didn't do it. We're still working on that. But the multiplier effect on the railroad was really staggering. And then other railroads jumped in to get their share of the action, investing in massive marine terminals along Baltimore's waterfront and creating new jobs. And pretty soon, you had the basis of the superb industrial transportation network, which we still enjoy to this day, which attracted more new industry to this state. In 1890, a steel company, then called Maryland Steel, started down at Sparrows Point. And Bethlehem Steel bought them out just before World War I. And Bethlehem at that time decided to come to Baltimore because of two indispensable forms of transportation that it had to have to succeed: the port and the railroads. Well, you talk about the benefits. You talk about economic development. In 1947, when 4 out of every 5 items made in America contained steel, you could do a lot worse than having Bethlehem Steel in the fold. Wanted me to be seen. What I have under there is not water. I admit it. And for many, many years, Bethlehem was Maryland's biggest employer. Now it's Johns Hopkins. And interestingly, Johns Hopkins Hospital, Johns Hopkins University, were named after a man whose wealth was amassed by his investments and his work in assorted port-related businesses. Let's take our library system in the city. Enoch Pratt, he operated ships out of here. William Walters, the art gallery, Walters Art Gallery, he operated ships out of here. George Peabody, the Peabody Institute, Mr. Peabody operated ships. So these are all men who bequeathed their fortunes to create the institutions which gave Baltimore its cultural identity. They made their money the same way by investing in different aspects of the maritime chain. And another gentleman whose name we still hear more about sometime is Alexander Brown. Now, he didn't bequeath an institution such as the Art Gallery or the Peabody, but what he did, he gave Baltimore tremendous recognition all over the world. And we could go on how the long arm of the Port of Baltimore has played nursemaid to infant companies like McCormick Spices. I'm glad I said something nice about them tonight. Or Black & Decker. They are still world leaders at this very moment, both of them. Again, they came because of the port. But more to the point, what has the port done for Baltimore lately? The port's mission is to stimulate widespread economic development, statewide. In this regard, the port has always exceeded its quota. Its economic impact data, nearly 16,000 high-paying jobs linked directly, and is still the only real blue-collar industry we have today with everything going overseas. There are another 17,000 indirect jobs. More than 79,000 other workers statewide benefit from port-related businesses. The port generates $1.5 billion in business revenues annually, puts $2 billion into the pocket of Maryland's workforce, and contributes another $220 million in tax revenues. Now, I have to point out that ports are fiercely competitive, and I'm happy to say that Baltimore has been keeping up with national rankings. In fact, we've improved in the past year or two. We are now 7th in value of cargo, and we are 13th, David? 13th in tonnage. So, and this is, we're getting closer to the top in both these categories. This hasn't been easy when you really look around at what's happened. After World War II, the port looked like a tired old warrior. Pratt Street piers were abysmal. The railroads who controlled the terminals were determined that trucks were not going to get in there, and they refused to spend any money to modernize their terminals. So there were a handful of us who in 1956, we were successful in agitating Annapolis to do something about it. And we were then able to get our state legislatures to create the same kind of quasi-governmental agency that rival ports were enjoying, and that was the establishment of the Maryland Port Authority. And they armed it with independence and funding to modernize Baltimore's waterfront. Now that was 50 years ago. So the Maryland Port Authority was established 50 years ago. We're celebrating all kinds of things this year. And you may, if you stop to think about it, it was 50 years ago that we began the interstate highway system under President Eisenhower. And that was a very important development for a port like Baltimore, that we could have these trucks going all over the country. So we did pretty good. And then we did a couple of other things towards the end of the last century. We got a 50-foot channel leading up so that the big new ships could dock here, and the iron ore ships, the big ore ships could come in fully loaded. The coal ships could go out. Coal ships taking coal from Western Maryland and West Virginia could go out fully loaded. And the decision was made in those days to orient the port toward attracting certain niche cargo, like ro-ro. Niche is a fancy word, niche. And when you talk about ro-ro, we're talking about anything that can be driven on or off a ship, like automobiles, farm equipment. They are not picked up by cranes. And then, so now that we are number one in the nation in ro-ro cargo, and we're number two in the nation on forest products. And forest products are primarily all of that beautiful paper on which your magazines are printed, the beautiful magazines and that comes in now through Baltimore, because our workers, our longshoremen, handle them so carefully. And believe it or not, I mean, you see these tremendous rolls of paper down there. And you wonder, I mean, why does it matter they have to be treated so gently? But you know, if a hook gets in there anywhere, that whole roll is destroyed. And that is a very expensive piece of damage. So we're concentrating on that. The paper is coming into Locust Point these days mostly, some down at Dundalk. And then over at Seagirt, which was a facility built in 1988, 89 it was opened, for containers. And Seagirt, incidentally, was built totally out of the material that was dredged under the I-95 tunnel. When you go through the I-95 tunnel, just think all of the dirt that was here before is now part of a very modern marine terminal. And you know, you keep hearing about the terrible, smelly waterfront. As they were dredging all this material at Seagirt, for I-95 tunnel, they checked every truckload carefully. And you know what? It was 95% clean. So the port has not been as filthy as everybody would like to say it is. Now, Seagirt is our primary container handling facility. And I'm sure that all of you know that it's in containers that most of America's booming foreign cargo is carried. But what you probably didn't know is that Seagirt set a record for efficiency last year and still holds it, when it made more container lifts per hour than any other seaport in the world. Not just in America, in the world. And I can assure you that our marketing people are out there that keep telling that story to our potential customers. So here we are. We have Seagirt, a very modern container terminal. We have Dundalk, which is a mixture of automobiles, of lumber, of whatever comes in. We have Locust Point, which is our paper terminals primarily. And then we are developing on south of Locust Point for automobiles again. But you know what? If we're going to keep up with it, we got to do even more. Dredging is one of the biggest problems that Baltimore faces. And I can well remember back in 1948 when we were first talking about a 42-foot channel. And the then chairman of the board of Bethlehem Steel, Eugene Grace, said, "What do you people in Baltimore want to waste money for? Ships will never be that big." It took us a year to turn him around. He finally came on board. Now we are begging and pushing and working hard to get a 50-foot container berth because the container ships today are drawing 46 to 48 feet of water when they're fully laden. Those that are on the water already. And that is a container ship that can carry 8,000 20-foot containers. Now, you know what's already on the drawing boards and in construction are ships that can carry 15,000 20-foot container, twice as big. Twice as big. So it's changing. We are going to start dredging for our 50-foot container berth next year. And, but it takes, in state government, it takes 2, 3, 4 years to get something done that the private sector might do in 1.5 years. But we're going to get it done. We're working on it. And the sale of this building is going to pay for half of the container berth. That's the only reason I didn't fight to keep the building. We need the money for the container berth. Another challenge is that we have to keep battling deep pocket developers for waterfront real estate and space to operate for future expansion needs. And the Baltimore City did give us 2 years ago a very key legislative victory by approving citywide zoning called for a 10-year moratorium limiting developers from remaining deepwater waterfront parcels. But we have to get that expanded. We have to get it expanded now because what we have found is that with a 10-year limit, the financial institutions aren't interested in financing such a project. They want 20 years or 30 years. And so we are in the process now of negotiating with the city fathers, the city council, who's been very, very supportive of making it a 20 to 25-year MIZOD limitation on the waterfront to keep what land we have for maritime development. And our other problem today is that we need more space. We need all of the space we can get because outside interests want to come to Baltimore. We are 150 miles inland. And for many, many years after the Interstate Commerce Commission was closed down in 1984, I think it was 82, Baltimore lost its advantage of being closer to the Midwest, but it's all what goes around comes around, they say. And we are now regaining that as the individual forms of transportation have the opportunity to determine what their true costs are of serving from Baltimore, serving from Norfolk, serving from Philadelphia. And they don't have to have a federal agency to tell them. They're just doing it on their own. But in order for us to keep up with the demand, we do need to get more space. We're doing it down in, I can't think of the name. David, tell me. No, Cox Creek is one, but near it. The automobile place. Who? Masonville, yeah, I keep forgetting. In Masonville. And Frank Hammond, who's in charge of our dredging program, has just worked out a wonderful agreement with the community down there and the Army Corps of Engineers and all of the other federal agencies involved in establishing what has to be set up to mitigate. You know, if you're going to fill in some water from waterland, you have to mitigate here to have a balance. And Frank Hammond, who handles our, as I said, our dredging, is just accomplished a wonderful agreement for expanding down there and saving the state a total of $27 million with what he did. So that's a great plus. I could go on and on and on, but I'll shut up. And Frank, whatever.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was a most interesting presentation. Mr. Katkow, first question.
I grew up within walking distance to the port and still have a fond recollection of walking down to the port on Pratt Street, and where the watermelon boats that came up from the south had a number of unsold watermelon. We would chip in, the kids, 5 cents, buy a whole watermelon, break off the pieces, feet dangling over the harbor, and throw the biodegradable rice into the harbor.
You hope. That was down near what would be Pier 4, Pratt Street today, right?
Right. Question. The one thing that you have not touched on at all, and which I think concerns everybody, is security. One reads about boats coming in from foreign ports with either little or no security checks, and it's a cause of major, major concern. I wonder if you would address yourself to that.
Sure. I just mentioned security in passing, but port security will always be a major issue, and in my personal opinion, you'll never be able to have 100% security at a waterfront. You got the water, people can come in by boat, and you have all of the trucks and transportation. However, despite that, I think we're doing a pretty good job. Even though the federal government has only given us about 5 cents for the ports compared to for every dollar they've given to the airports, the ports have really been putting forth and putting up some money of their own and using all of their brain power, manpower, etc., to do the best. We do have, the gates are checked, and there are 2 systems in use right now to check the containers when they come off. And the U.S. government has agents in some of the key ports overseas to check the containers over there where the traffic is the heaviest. We can't have it in all. May come to that at some point. But, and there's a very good network of information that is passed on from port to port, from customs officer to customs officer, immigration officers, etc. Will it ever be perfect? No. But it's getting there. We have it's taken 3 years, nearly 4 years, to get the port identification card for that everybody who has business in a port will have a uniform card that will take them in and out of any port and any federal site. It's called a TWIC card. And there's been a lot of delays on getting that done. But I think from what I'm hearing, within the next 6 months, we should have the TWIX card. We do have a pretty good system here. I'll show you mine.
A rabbit did not emerge at that point.
this is my security card. Now, the port has added onto this on their own another little covering down here, so that gives me additional permission to go into various institutions. But will it be done? Yeah, I think it will be done soon. Soon enough? Well, let's hope. We've been lucky in this country so far since 9/11. And everybody is quite alert whenever they see something, and they report it. And we just keep our fingers crossed.
I'll repeat it for the camera, Helen.
Okay.
Lane wants to know, what did you mean by the Port of
Closest.
Baltimore no longer having a huge advantage because of geographic proximity to the Midwest?
In the first 100 years, from roughly 1878 to 1981-82, there was what we had known as the Interstate Commerce Commission. And under the Interstate Commerce Commission, the freight rates were assessed according to the miles that were covered, whether it was by truck or by rail. And because we were then the closest inland, we had the shortest distance, so we had the cheapest land rates. And at that time, the ocean freight rates were the same all up and down the North Atlantic coast, and then you had the South Atlantic, which were the South Atlantic's area, and the Gulf Coast. These were all regulated in those days by various federal laws. That went out when the ICC was abolished in 1982. We did get hurt when that first went out. Norfolk really began to get busy, and Philadelphia and New York said, there's no advantage going to Baltimore. However, as times have changed and as space has become more scarce everywhere, and as Baltimore has continued to do a superb job in handling cargo and the ships and the speed in which they're in and out, we have regained what we had lost for about a decade or more. And we're doing pretty good. That answer your question?
The question is, what do you do with mothballed ships if you don't break them up yourself for scrap metal?
Well, we were doing them down at Sparrows Point and also at Boston Metals on the Fairfield side. And then because the price of steel went down so far, it wasn't worthwhile doing them here, and they began sending them overseas. And it was because there were a lot of PCPs and asbestos, et cetera, in the ships. And the story came back. Senator Mikulski got legislation passed that would prevent the United States from selling these ships overseas in those countries unless they were completely cleaned out here before they went over. Now, there's been 4 ships in, I think they're still in legal entanglements, that did go over to England a year ago or a year and a half ago. We are trying to get back in this country to keep all of that here. First of all, the work is good. Sparrows Point has done, I think, 2 or 3 ships recently, and they have bid on a couple of others. The price of steel determines how much a bidder will pay to the Maritime Administration or the Navy. And if they're useless here, what are we going to do with them? That's a big issue. James River Fleet is a major issue because some of the legislators from Hampton Roads have been very fearful that some of those ships are going to sink in the river. And that has been an argument in Congress for about 5 years now. It still is. It is not clear.
The question
Slavery.
was, would you comment upon the impact of slavery upon the port and the port's impact upon slavery? And Mrs. Bentley says she doesn't know.
No, I've never gotten into the slavery issue.
Yes, sir. The question is, would you comment on foreign ownership of American ports?
Well, let me say this. There's no ownership of American ports anywhere, okay? Foreign ownership. There is foreign ownership of different terminals in American ports. And that's what was the issue when you're talking about the P&O Ports Dubai thing that happened several months ago and is still in the process. The media, I remember this very well. I got a call on a Sunday morning from a friend of mine and said, "What are we selling the Port of Baltimore for?" Sunday morning, you know. I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" It's in the paper this morning. I said, it's in the paper. The paper doesn't know what they're talking about. So, to make a long story short, the media really got that stirred up. And a couple of members of Congress got themselves stirred up. And it was all presented wrong. Now, Dubai, which is the company that bought all of P&O ports all over the world, Dubai World Ports it's called, has agreed on their own that they will sell the U.S. entity to an American company only. They are keeping the rest of it. But I want to point out that Dubai has a lot of business in this country. They handle a lot of cargo at Kennedy Airport. They handle a lot of business all over this country, as do others. And so if we're going to start limiting them at the seaport, we're going to have to make a lot of changes in our whole structure. But they have agreed, and I understand that the decision will be made within the next month or sooner as to who will buy the U.S. segment of P&O Ports. P&O Ports happens to be the largest stevedore company. It's a stevedore company. And this is, again, where a lot of people get things mixed up. The company that hires longshoremen throughout this country is known as a stevedore company. It's the stevedore. The longshoremen are the workers. P&O Ports happens to be the largest stevedore company in Maryland. And Baltimore happens to be one of their most profitable entities. They do a good job, the men do a good job, etc. They operate, we have a total of 3 stevedore companies, but P&O is the largest. Los Angeles, you have a couple of Chinese companies have major terminals. You have Maersk, a Danish company, which has major terminals all over. You have a couple of other British companies which have terminals all over. So, you know, when the issue came up, I think it was a time when Congress didn't have any other scandal to attack. And so they took this on and made a big issue of it. But candidly, I wouldn't object to somebody like Dubai with certain restrictions having the business here, doing the business here. We need money for investment in the port, and they have it. And they are investing, as I said, all over this country. So, you know, what are we going to do? Okay.
The question was, what is the ratio of exports to imports, and what do we export?
I don't have the figure right on the top of my tongue, but I'm going to guess it's probably 3 to 1. We export 1 portion to 3 portions of imports. That is a guess. I'll get you the figure accurately, David, if you want it. The export, I get in sort of, when we're talking about let's lower the dollar, keep lowering the dollar, lowering the value of the dollar because we can export more. Well, you know, what in the hell do we have to export? If we keep, even if whether we lower the dollar or we don't lower. I mean, that's what's sad. And I am not a happy camper about that because, as you know, I've always been one who's touted American industry and American jobs. But we're getting into a whole new globalization, and it's changing. And so we have to, I'm a Marylander now. I'm an advocate for the Port of Baltimore, and I say we got to get our share of the imports, and we did pretty good on exports. The state of Maryland did pretty good last year. Oh, God, well, it was a pretty high figure. I was amazed that Maryland industry, manufacturers, exported up into the high millions last year through our port. So we are doing something right.
7.1 billion.
7 point?
7.1 billion.
So, who's talking? Eris? That's what I thought, his voice. I didn't see him. Okay. 7.1 billion.
Up from 4.2 in 2000.
Yeah, so we almost doubled our exports. So that was pretty good. 7.1 billion. We need to do even better. And our industries are turning too.
What is the product that we export? What do we...
Mix of everything. Unfortunately, one of our main products, and I'll say this, and it hurts me to say this, happens to be waste paper and lumber. We do export that. But I can't tell you what the items are in Maryland. Gore-Tex up in Cecil County. Gore-Tex, for instance, does a lot of selling overseas, and they export. I'll get it for you, David.
Helen, we have a limit that we try to adhere to
Okay.
for ending the session. This has been extraordinarily informative, and it's a great pleasure for all of us to be in the company of one of Maryland's great legends, wonderful contributor to the
Old-timers.
community. That too, but many well-used years. Thanks very, very much, Helen.